Welcome to another episode of Horns of a Dilemma, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and in today's episode, Dr. Melvyn Leffler speaks about his book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, and the Invasion of Iraq. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did listening to it. And with that, on to the conversation.
It is a pleasure and an opportunity to come here to talk about my recent book. And I thought I would use this opportunity just to tell you how I went about writing the book, what I learned as I wrote the book, what are the key points of the book, and what are the lessons that I believe can be extrapolated from the American adventure in Iraq. I went to work on this because I believed about 15 years ago that the U.S. decision to go to war in Iraq was probably the most consequential American decision since the end of the Cold War. I also went to work on it because I felt that the invasion and the occupation ended in tragedy. The war in Iraq and the insurgency that followed and the counterinsurgency and the domestic strife and bloodletting inside Iraq after the U.S. invasion led to the deaths of 200 to 250,000 Iraqis. It led to the displacement of 8 to 9 million Iraqis, about a third of the pre-war population of Iraq. The war led to the deaths of 9,000 American soldiers and private contractors. It's now estimated that the war will cost American taxpayers approximately $2 trillion, that's with a T, $2 trillion. The war enhanced Iranian power in the Persian Gulf. It diverted attention and resources from America's struggle in Afghanistan. It divided the United States from America's European allies, and it provided additional opportunities for China's rise and for Russia's revanchism. The invasion and the occupation fueled the sense of grievance amongst Muslims. It heightened anti-Americanism throughout the Middle East, and it actually wound up complicating George W. Bush's global war on terrorism. Also, very consequentially, the war, the invasion, the occupation accentuated partisan rifts inside the United States and sundered trust in government because so many Americans came to believe that Bush and his advisors had lied to the American people. So with this sequence of negative consequences, I could not help but ask, why did the war take place? And why did the invasion and the occupation go so badly? And there are 4 key themes to my book: fear, power, hubris, and dysfunction. Too much fear of another attack. Too much fear that in the intermediate or the long term, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction might circumscribe or limit the exercise of American power in the Middle East region and the Persian Gulf. Fear, power, the belief that the United States had the capabilities, possessed the military capabilities to overcome the threat that was perceived. This was particularly true after the United States quickly won what seemed at the time to be an unexpected, stunning success in Afghanistan in late November and early December 2001, when the Taliban relinquished power in Kabul and al-Qaeda fled from its training camps inside Afghanistan. Previous to that, critics were saying that the administration was once again enveloped in a quagmire. And then suddenly, American special forces, along with the Northern Alliance, triumphed in Afghanistan. This tremendously fueled a sense of power. If we could be successful in Afghanistan, the Bush administration thought perhaps it could be successful against other state sponsors of terrorists. And then there was hubris, the belief that American forces would be embraced by Iraqis. What was so compellingly important to the members of the George W. Bush administration, like Vice President Cheney and National Security Advisor Condi Rice, they had been part of the experience of winning the Cold War in 1989 and 90, and what they had in their heads, in their minds, was the spectacular image of the Berlin Wall falling down and East Germans celebrating in the streets and triumphing with their newfound freedom. And the expectation was that Iraqis would greet American soldiers with the same type of enthusiasm. Iraqi exiles told President Bush, literally in the Oval Office, if American soldiers invaded Iraq, they would be met with chocolates and flowers, the Iraqi exiles told them. And President Bush believed this. There was hubris involved in this. And then there was dysfunction, a tremendous amount of acrimony and friction and flawed decision-making amongst President Bush and his associates in the government. Now, this sounds like a litany of criticism, but anyone who reads my book will know that the purpose of my book is not to indict, nor is my purpose to acquit. What I try to really do in my book, on every single page, is to understand, to explain, to assess, and to learn. Now, my sources include a set of very unusual interviews that I myself conducted with virtually every single important member of the Bush administration, except the president himself, who refused my requests repeatedly for an interview. But yes, I spent hours with Vice President Cheney, with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, with Paul Wolfowitz, with Scooter Libby, and with many other top advisors, and also with subordinates, people that you may not have ever heard of, like Michael Morrell, who was the president's daily CIA briefer during the year after 9/11. So I had my own set of interviews. But I want to emphasize that I did not really rely on these interviews to make the most important points in my book. Yes, the interviews, as everyone who's read my book says, add color to it. They're evocative. They are illuminating. But I always believed, as I conducted my interviews, that the people I was interviewing were far better able to spin than I was to probe. Most of these people were extremely experienced, talking to very persistent journalists. They knew how to retort to every type of criticism that would be leveled. And I was very well aware of that. And so from the very onset, I made a commitment to myself to try to get access to as many written documents as I could. And of course, I'm known as a Cold War historian who has spent years and years going through archival boxes in presidential libraries and the National Archives with hundreds of boxes of documents. And of course, none of that is possible if you're writing about George W. Bush and events as recent as this century, 20 years ago, those documents simply have not been declassified. Now, there are mandatory declassification requests from myself and other people, and there are freedom of information requests, and I try to access and read and utilize as many of these documents as I could. I also benefited greatly from a British parliamentary investigation of the Blair administration. Tony Blair, Prime Minister Tony Blair, of course, went to war as the key ally of the United States. And most Englishmen and Englishwomen were very unhappy with Tony Blair's decision. And there was, subsequent to his leaving office, a comprehensive parliamentary investigation, essentially asking the question, why did Tony Blair go to war on the side of the United States? And every single leading member of the Blair administration, every intelligence officer, every important military officer was obligated by parliamentary requirements to testify. And every time a member of the British government testified, let's say Foreign Minister Jack Straw, if he said, well, I got this memo from my assistant so-and-so on a particular date, the parliamentary inquiry had the right to subpoena the document, and they were obligated to make those documents accessible to the public. And eventually around 2015 and 2016, hundreds, thousands of British documents went up on the web on a particular website. Now, this was about British decision-making. It wasn't about George W. Bush himself, but repeatedly, British officials like Jack Straw, the foreign minister, would talk about his conversations with Colin Powell, the American Secretary of State, and so on and so forth. And from these documents, I gathered a lot of information that really shaped some of the most provocative themes of my book. I also used captured Iraqi documents. When American soldiers invaded and occupied Baghdad, they seized lots of Iraqi documents and they brought them to the United States. Hundreds, probably several thousand of these documents were translated. I don't read Arabic. I read the documents that were translated and also put up on various websites. And these documents helped me understand part of the Iraqi story, helped me understand Saddam Hussein's actions and motivations. And also, many of you don't know, but Saddam Hussein, like LBJ and Richard Nixon, actually taped a lot of his conversations with his advisors. And these tapes were found, and many of the conversations were translated, and there's a book now published by Cambridge University Press of Saddam's conversations that were on these tapes that help illuminate his mindset. And finally, I used a lot of UN sources, especially for the next to last chapter of my book, that deals with the UN inspection process during the latter part of 2002, early 2003. As I researched these documents, I saw more complexity than I had imagined. As I researched, I saw more contingency than I had expected. In contrast to what so many books argue, I demonstrate that the Bush administration, President Bush himself, did not come into office intent on going to war in Iraq. There would have been no invasion of Iraq without 9/11. There would have been no invasion of Iraq without Saddam Hussein as the leader of that country. There would have been no invasion of Iraq if American officials did not believe that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction. Accounts that stress the decision to invade Iraq was inevitable, I think, are just plain wrong. Although the documents clearly demonstrate that the administration embraced the policy of regime change from its onset, a policy inherited from the Clinton administration, a policy of regime change. There never was any commitment whatsoever to go to war to bring about regime change prior to 9/11. And it is clear from the written record that President Bush himself never assigned a high priority to the goal of regime change in Iraq before 9/11. I saw more complexity, more contingency. I also became, as I researched the book, I also became more empathetic to Bush and his advisors, and at the same time, more critical. I came to understand the fears and the emotions that gripped policymakers, the apprehension, the anger over the fact that 9/11 had taken place, the embarrassment that they felt that it had happened on their watch. And most of all, I was impressed by the sense of responsibility that policymakers felt that they must not allow another such attack to happen again. But as I wrestled with this evidence and became more empathetic, I was also shocked, and still am, by the flaws in the policy process, the poor planning, and the unwillingness to re-examine assumptions and to think long and hard about consequences. Now, I know that my book is just going to be one of the first serious historical analyses of the Bush administration, and there will be many more books to come that rely on many more documents that will eventually be declassified. But I thought I would take this opportunity to state my most important contributions. First, I argue in my book that President Bush himself was the key decision maker. Now, as a historian who's written a lot about the history of American foreign policy, I never found it spectacularly surprising that the president was the key decision maker. What was more surprising was the vast number of books, articles, and even films that claim the opposite, that claim that Vice President Cheney was the key decision maker, or Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, or most of all, the neocon villain Paul Wolfowitz. What I found and what I demonstrate pretty clearly, time and again, President Bush himself made all the key decisions regarding Iraq. And in making these decisions, he often disregarded the advice of Cheney and Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz. Bush decided almost immediately to wage what became known as the global war on terror. This was his war. He decided that the United States, that his administration would hold states who sponsored terrorists, who provided training grounds, he would hold them as responsible as the terrorists themselves. These were Bush's policies. Bush decided to work with Tony Blair. Bush decided in July and August of 2002, against the advice of Cheney, against the advice of Rumsfeld, against the advice of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bush decided in late July, August 2002, not to bomb northern Iraq where there were al-Qaeda terrorists located. He decided that. He decided, against the advice of Dick Cheney, to go back to the United Nations and seek a resolution. Bush made the key decisions. I also show that Bush, contrary to many arguments, did not rush to war. President Bush did not rush to war. War planning did not mean war. So it's often said, and it's true, factually it's true. In late November, early December 2001, just 3 months after 9/11, Bush requested that his military people revise the war plan for Iraq, and war planning began in December of 2001. But that war planning did not mean that the president was committed to going to war. In fact, after General Tommy Franks, who was the head of Central Command, the key war planner, after he visited Crawford, Texas, Christmas time 2001, Tommy Franks went to Crawford to talk to President Bush about the first new iteration of the war plan. And this is what General Franks, said about meeting and talking to Bush. Franks did not say this to me. He said this in another interview. He said, "I never got the sense that Bush wanted to go to war. That was never communicated to me. I left the ranch at Crawford thinking it was not certain that America would go to war, but it was certain that we would set the conditions in the region that would allow us to launch a decisive campaign should the president order us to do so," end quote. Now, in my book, another important argument is that I try to demonstrate that Bush's motives were not the same as his goals. We should not conflate motives and goals. I show that Bush was not motivated by oil, as many have written. He was not motivated by his pro-Israeli advisors. He was not inspired by a missionary fervor to spread democracy, as is said time and time again. Now, if Bush went to war, he did hope to spread freedom and nurture democracy. He did hope to do that if he went to war. But that was not why he went to war. I argue in my book that his overriding objective was to prevent another attack. And in the book, I examine the mix of emotions, interests, ideas, and ideals that shaped his thinking and his calculations. Fear and power, guilt and hubris, uncertainty and credibility, danger and opportunity. I argue that guilt over 9/11, the president and his associates felt incredibly guilty that 9/11 had happened on their watch. That didn't mean that they necessarily believed that they could have prevented 9/11. They did not believe that. But what they knew in their heads was they had not done everything they might have to try to thwart an attack. They felt guilty about that. They also felt fear of political retribution should another attack occur. They frequently said, the American people might forgive us, have forgiven us for the first attack, but they will not forgive us should another attack occur. But most of all, What the documents demonstrate is that President Bush and his associates felt an overriding sense of responsibility to prevent another attack, I explain why there was so much fear of another attack. And there was reason to be fearful. There was absolutely no doubt that Al-Qaeda wanted to launch another attack on the United States. Intelligence analysts developed almost immediately after 9/11 what they called a threat matrix, which every single day listed the intelligence information that had come in the previous day or two, signifying the prospect of another attack. And this threat matrix was given to the president every single morning. And sometimes it was a list of 40 or 50 things in which President Bush would sit there with his CIA briefer and with Condi Rice, his national security advisor, and with Dick Cheney, and say, tell me about number 4 threat. Tell me about number 17 threat. Tell me about number 25 threat. There was a tremendous sense of impending attack. And then keep in mind, during the very weeks after 9/11, there was the anthrax scare inside the United States. Envelopes with anthrax spores were circulated in the mail. Some of these envelopes turned up in the United States Senate office building. The Senate office building was closed. House buildings were closed. The Supreme Court moved to another location temporarily. There was tremendous preoccupation about the possibility of a chemical attack. All the more so because when American special forces went into the training camps of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in November and December of 2001, they found incontrovertible evidence that Al-Qaeda was seeking chemical and biological weapons. So there was reason to be fearful. And there was good reason, I argue in my book, for President Bush to shift his attention in December and January 2001 to Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the only leader in the world who gloated over 9/11. His newspapers celebrated what happened on 9/11. Saddam Hussein had links to terrorist groups, if not Al-Qaeda. He supported extensively suicide missions. He had used weapons of mass destruction, and there were ongoing reports in the fall of 2001 that he was restarting or accelerating his chemical and weapons programs. And at the same time, most of all, in the fall of 2001 and early 2002, Saddam Hussein continued to refuse to allow UN inspectors to carry out their mission. So in my assessment, there was understandable reason to focus on Iraq. That doesn't mean, and I do not argue, that there was reason to go to war. But there should have been no surprise. It would have been irresponsible not to pay attention to Iraq at this point in time. In the book, I spend a lot of time assessing what intelligence analysts knew or thought they knew about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. I show that the intelligence analysts struggled. They struggled poorly, but they struggled to do the best they could with suspect informers and inadequate, indeed poor collection methods. I describe at some length what Michael Morrell, the president's daily CIA briefer, told the president. Hussein, Morrell informed Bush, had nothing to do with 9/11. Zero, zippo, nothing, quote unquote, from Michael Morell. But Morell also told Bush that Iraq was a terrorist state. Quote, they conduct their own terrorism. Their intelligence services conducts terrorism in places around the world, and they give money, training to a bunch of Palestinian groups, end quote. Morell told the president that Hussein and al-Qaeda did not have close relationships. He said, although Hussein and al-Qaeda had diametrically opposed interests and ideological predilections, the possibility nevertheless exists of limited cooperation against a mutual enemy, the United States. I claim in the book that because of these fears and apprehensions, the president developed a strategy that he and his national security advisor, Condi Rice, like to call coercive diplomacy. Coercive diplomacy was an effort to intimidate Saddam Hussein and encourage him to flee. Coercive diplomacy also was an effort to intimidate Saddam Hussein and encourage him to invite back the inspectors and cooperate with them. I show in the book how President Bush tried to implement coercive diplomacy in conjunction with the British. And in so doing, I spend a lot of time in a key chapter outlining the close relations that developed between Prime Minister Blair and between President Bush, close relations that developed between David Manning, Blair's national security advisor, and Condi Rice, close relations that developed between Foreign Minister Jack Straw and Colin Powell, the American Secretary of State. What's important in my book is that I show also that coercive diplomacy was contingent on Saddam Hussein's response. The end result might not have been war if Saddam Hussein had acted differently. In fact, I start my book with a chapter on Saddam Hussein because I believe that no one can understand the entirety of this situation without really understanding Saddam Hussein's character and his career, both his achievements, which were noteworthy in the 1970s, and his failures, which were even more noteworthy in the 1980s and 1990s. No one can understand what happened unless they understand Saddam Hussein's opportunism, brutality, pragmatism, inconsistency, adventurism, and megalomania. Now, in the book, I interrogate the flawed implementation of coercive diplomacy. I'm critical of coercive diplomacy. It was beset by competing goals and contradictory priorities. I show that it was launched without much consideration of how it might play out and without careful consideration of the end game. President Bush, I show, vested U.S. credibility, vested his own credibility in the process of coercive diplomacy without examining the costs and consequences should coercive diplomacy fail to elicit the results he wanted. And finally, in the last chapter of my book, I look at the occupation of Iraq in March and April and May and June and July of 2003. And I demonstrate the unpreparedness, the dysfunction, the friction and the acrimony amongst the top officials themselves. I look at the strained relations between Jay Garner, who was appointed to head the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, and General Tommy Franks, who was the head of Central Command. Real friction between them. I look at the friction that existed between Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and Paul Bremer, the person President Bush appointed to lead the coalition provisional authority to govern all of Iraq. Bremer and Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was the key decision maker in Washington, Bremer the key decision maker in Iraq, and they had totally different views, and I mean that literally, totally different views of what should be done inside Iraq. Simply stated, Donald Rumsfeld did not care a whit about what happened inside Iraq once Saddam Hussein was toppled from power and once the United States got confirmation that there were no weapons of mass destruction. He didn't care what happened. Paul Bremer cared a great deal. And he talked to President Bush about developing what he called the shock absorbers of a civil society. He wanted to rebuild and reconstruct Iraqi institutions. And President Bush embraced that. But he's had a Secretary of Defense who cared not a whit about this. This friction and acrimony contributed greatly to the disorder and chaos that immediately became apparent. Immediately. And it was clear by April, and certainly clear by July 2003, that the United States did not have enough troops inside Iraq, and that they were poorly configured to deal with the chaos. Rumsfeld was responsible for that. Bush did not overrule Rumsfeld. So overall, my book is designed to capture the texture of the decision-making process. I illuminate the challenges that inhered in the post-9/11 environment. I try to outline the strengths of President Bush, and I think there were considerable strengths to his leadership. But even more so, I highlight the weaknesses of his leadership. I underscore the difficult challenges he faced. They were difficult challenges. Containment, in my opinion, was breaking down. His officials knew containment was breaking down. The sanction regime that had existed was collapsing. The inspection process had ended. The no-fly zones in the north and the south were being challenged. And Saddam Hussein's conventional military strengths were already growing in 1998 and 1999 and 2000, although still greatly degraded from what they had been in 1990. These were real challenges. But the tragedy of Iraq occurred because of too much fear, too much power, too much hubris, too much dysfunction. Let me conclude by talking about some of the lessons that I think can be learned. Policymakers need to modulate their fears. There was a lot of talk in 2001 and 2002 in policymaking circles and in the newspapers about Saddam Hussein constituting an existential threat to the United States. What in the world is an existential threat? Did Saddam Hussein, even if he had weapons of mass destruction, even if he had chemical and biological weapons, did that constitute an existential threat? Ultimately, I show in my book that policymakers conflated the evil that Saddam Hussein personified, real evil, with a magnitude of threat that he did not embody. So it's important to modulate perceptions of threat. Think carefully about them. It's also important for policymakers to re-examine basic assumptions. The overriding assumption during this entire period of time was that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. I show in my book that policymakers sincerely believed that. Why did they believe it? They believed that even though they were told that the literal evidence that had been gathered was far from dispositive, far from definitive. They knew that. But they still believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Why did they believe it? They believed it because Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. He had used weapons of mass destruction. He had lied about his weapons of mass destruction. He had concealed his weapons of mass destruction. And American intelligence analysts in the past had usually underestimated the progress he had made. As a historian, I was impressed by the history lessons that the policymakers had learned. Everything historically would suggest this guy had weapons of mass destruction. What the policymakers needed to do was to step back and re-examine. They were told, we only know 50% sure that he had chemical weapons, 30% sure that he had biological weapons, et cetera, et cetera. They needed to step back and re-examine assumptions. Now, it's easy for me to say this, right? And all of you are probably shaking, yeah, we need to re-examine assumptions. How many of you ever re-examine your most basic assumptions? How often do I re-examine my basic assumptions? Very, very rarely. But the lesson here, the real lesson here, is when policymakers are going to do something as consequential as going to war, you need to step back and re-examine fundamental assumptions. You need to also grasp another lesson. You need to grasp the limits of American power. Grasp the limits of American power. Policymakers were right in believing that American military capabilities were absolutely superior. There was no challenger, even amongst the great powers, to the United States in 2002, 2003. There was no doubt that the United States could defeat the Iraqi military. But there was a lot of doubt about whether you could remake Iraqi society and culture and political institutions. You need to understand the limits of American power, and you need to also curb your hubris to realize that Iraqi sensibilities were totally different than American sensibilities. We thought we were the heroes. We had won the Cold War and produced freedom. What were Iraqis thinking? Iraqi Kurds were thinking how many times the United States had betrayed them in the past. Iraqi Shia were thinking, oh, George W. Bush's father told us to rise up against Saddam Hussein in 1991, and when he slaughtered us, Bush's father did nothing. It was important to understand the sensibilities of the society you were dealing with and not to project your own images and beliefs. Policymakers need to carefully examine the costs and consequences of what they're doing. What's striking in all the evidence that we have is how little effort was spent really studying, examining costs and consequences. And to the extent that it was, there was a very well-known memorandum written in the State Department called The Perfect Storm, written in the Near East Division by people very well informed about Iraq. The Perfect Storm, all the things that could go wrong. Secretary of State Powell had this memorandum in his suit jacket when he had a very important conversation with President Bush in August of 2002. That memorandum was secret for a long time, but it's now available. The Perfect Storm Memorandum. I invite you to read this memorandum. It is a terrible memorandum. It is simply a laundry list of things that could go wrong. Here are the 20 things that could go wrong pre-invasion. Here are the 25 things that could go wrong during the invasion. And post-invasion, there's list A of 25 things could go wrong, and list B, another 25 things could go wrong, with absolutely no effort to assess which of these things were really important. A lesson is, for people who are skeptical or opposed to going to war and are inside the administration, you need to do better work. And Secretary of State Powell and Condi Rice should have told them, write a better memorandum. I would have told my students to rewrite this paper. Well, in conclusion, I hope you will ponder, as I often do, whether the venture in Iraq was flawed because of its conceptualization, or whether it was doomed because of poor execution, or both. This is a really difficult issue, I think. But whatever you conclude, I'm certain that the invasion of Iraq will long be regarded as a landmark decision in the history of American foreign policy. On May 1st, 2003, President Bush landed on an aircraft carrier off the coast of San Diego to announce that coalition troops had prevailed. And in the background was a famous banner that most of you have seen that said, "Mission accomplished." Mission accomplished. That was 20 years ago, almost to the day. Little could President Bush have imagined that 20 years later, we would be examining why that mission went so badly, why understandable intentions turned into a tragedy, and why we remain obligated to think and ponder constructive lessons that we can apply in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.